Hi guys, welcome back to Mer Murder, where we put the Mer in murder. I'm your host, Mercedes Rose, and I'm so glad to be back this week. I am so thankful, and I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you for not being too mad at me for being gone for so long, but I'm so glad to be back this week. I don't really have any updates or anything really crazy to talk about, but I was wondering how long would it take you guys to report someone is missing? Because this is often something I think about because I have so many people in my life that I love, but I know me, I hate to be on my phone sometimes. Like, it's either I'm scrolling or I have no idea where my phone is at all. Like, at all. Like, if you ask my boyfriend, he'll be like, ask her where her phone is at right now. I promise you she doesn't know. Why? Because I have it, because she left it somewhere on a counter or in her car or at our job. Like, it's just always something. But I don't know. I feel like people don't really hear from me. Like, I don't know. And then it freaks me out because I'm like, if I was missing for like 2 days, I think people would just be like, I haven't heard from her. It's okay. It would probably take people like, I don't know. How long would it take you guys to report me missing, please? I think it would take people like 3 days. I hope shorter, but like, I think I really don't use my phone. I think if I was like radio silent on all social media, no one saw me. And I think if my family or boyfriend didn't hear from me after like, I would hope if they didn't hear from me after like a day, they'd be like sick. But I think for sure my boyfriend, if it took me, like if he did not hear from me like at all for a day, like didn't see me, didn't hear from me, he has my location. So I think if that were like off or something, I think it would literally take like half a day. I would hope. I think me personally though, if I didn't hear from any of my family members for like 2 solid days, I would start panicking for sure. For surely. Actually, no, I know myself and I immediately go to the worst possible thing ever. So I think if I didn't hear from like my best friend or my family for like 12 hours, I would be like, oh my God, call the police. I think I would freak out really bad. But you guys let me know. Let me know how long it would take you to report somebody you love missing, and then how long you think it would take other people to report you missing, because I really want to know. I want to know if I'm crazy or not, or if maybe I should be more upset that people just wouldn't give a fuck. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, guys, we're just gonna get right into the episode. Don't forget to support me on all platforms. I'm on all listening platforms and all social media platforms, and when you get the chance, please give the show a 5-star rating if you love me. If you don't, then get ready to go missing. I'm just kidding. Yeah, thank you guys so much for your support, and let's get right into the episode. So this episode of Mer Murder is a special one because it is the first episode of our new United States serial killer series. This series will cover the stories of serial killers from each U.S. state. However, I do have some stipulations. I'm going to try my best to cover lesser known stories for the sake of keeping things interesting, but also more importantly in hopes of highlighting the stories of victims that are lesser known. So you will definitely not be hearing about Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy, but you will also not be hearing about those serial killers because the serial killers designated to each state must also be originally from the state that they were active in. So each serial killer must be born in the state that they were committing a majority or all of their crimes in. Ted Bundy, for example, was born in Vermont, but he doesn't count for that state because he committed his crimes primarily in California, Florida, and Utah, but none of them in Vermont. So please keep this in mind as we travel throughout the states. We will be covering each state in alphabetical order, so let's get into the first serial killer of our series from Alabama, Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Granny. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, which is actually a part of what is known as Anniston, Alabama today. She was born to her parents Louisa Holder and James Hazel, who had 6 children in total, including Nannie, 5 girls and 1 boy. Nannie and her siblings tried their best to have a normal childhood despite their circumstances, as their father was very controlling and abusive. James Hazel was originally a railroader, but sometime in 1920 he took over the family farm, where he forced his children to work instead of attending school. This resulted in Nannie having an extremely poor academic performance and a growing hatred for her father. Nannie often enjoyed reading her mother's romance magazines and browsing the Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper. She always dreamt of her own fairy tale romance, but her father was always nearby to kill her dreams of love and romance. James refused to allow his daughters to attend school dances or any other social events for that matter, and he forbade them from wearing makeup or any clothes that he deemed, quote, attractive, because he believed it would prevent them from being molested. Unfortunately, Nannie herself was a victim of rape on multiple occasions throughout her childhood, but her father never believed her. Nannie did find times of solace, however, when she was able to hop on the train with her family and visit her relatives in southern Alabama. She traveled to see them often from a very young age, but one trip when she was 7 years old impacted her greatly. During this trip, the train made a sudden stop, causing Nannie to lose her balance and fall face first into a metal bar attached to the seat in front of her. For years following this incident, Nannie suffered severe headaches, blackouts, and severe depression. She would later credit this incident as the catalyst of her mental instability. In 1921, at just 16 years old, Nannie got married to a man named Charlie Braggs after strong encouragement from her father. Charlie and Nannie worked at a linen factory, and the pair only dated for 4 months before officially tying the knot. Nannie and Charlie's marriage was not the fairy tale she always dreamt of, largely due to his familial life. Charlie was born an only child to a single mother who refused to live without him, whether he was married or not. So when Nannie and Charlie got married, it was more like Nannie got married to Charlie and his mother. She couldn't seem to escape her and often found herself fighting for attention from her new husband and often losing to his mother. But regardless of this, the pair found enough time to have 4 children together, all girls from the years 1923 to 1927. The firstborn daughter was Melvina, the second was Gertrude, then came Zelmer, and finally Florine Braggs. Now, with a growing family but an unstable foundation, the Braggs family began to suffer. Nannie began to drink and smoke heavily, leading to an addiction to cope with the stress, and fears of infidelity began to swarm in their relationship from both ends, especially since Charlie would often disappear for days on end. And remember, this is the 20s, so if your man just up and left for days, there was no way of tracking him, no way of communicating with him, nothing. Nannie was pretty much just in the dark whenever he was gone. The relationship took its first major and irreparable hit in 1927 when the couple's 2 middle daughters, Gertrude and Zelmer Braggs, suddenly and inexplicably passed away shortly after eating breakfast that their mother prepared for them. Their deaths were ruled as complications from food poisoning, but it was unclear if someone purposely made them ill or if the food they ingested was simply contaminated. Following this incident, Charlie took their firstborn daughter Melvina and fled the chaos and grief-filled family home, leaving his mother, wife, and newborn daughter Florine behind. But not long following Charlie's departure, his own mother actually passed away, and it was now just Nannie and her newborn daughter Florine, who she had to support on her own now that her husband was gone. So Nannie moved back in with her parents and went down to the local cotton mill to get herself a job to support her and her baby. One day in the summer of 1928, guess who returned? Charlie Braggs, along with their eldest daughter, Melvina. Charlie did not come back to fix his family, however. He was actually there to do the complete opposite. As he showed up to Nannie's home, he was accompanied by another woman, a new love interest who was recently divorced, and along with her was her own child. He handed over Melvina to Nannie, as well as divorce papers, and the two were divorced shortly after. According to Charlie, he left Nannie Hazel and their family because he was, quote, truly frightened of her. And if you as a grown man were afraid of your wife, how do you think your children felt? I know and completely understand that men can be victims of domestic abuse, and I'm not discrediting his experience or his feelings whatsoever, but why would you leave your children with someone that you yourself were so afraid of? Your young and defenseless children at that. But anyway, Nannie Hazel didn't seem to let this keep her out of the game for that long. Just a year later, in 1929, she met a man named Robert Franklin Harrelson, better known as Frank, and the two got married shortly after. The couple was just 23 or 24 years old at the time. They lived in Jacksonville, Alabama with Nannie's 2 young daughters, Melvina and Florine, and things seemed fine for a few months until Nannie learned that her new husband was a violent alcoholic who also had a criminal record for assault. Not much is stated about their relationship from that point on, but they did last another 16 years despite this newfound information. They lasted until Frank's untimely death in 1945. In 1943, at just 38 years old, Nannie became a grandmother to Melvina's firstborn son, Robert Lee Higgins. And just 2 years later, in 1945, Melvina welcomed her second child, a baby girl, but unfortunately, the baby passed away shortly after her birth. According to Malvina, while she was still exhausted from labor and groggy due to the ether her mother gave her to sedate her, she witnessed her mother stick a hat pin into the baby's head before she lost consciousness again. When she was fully awake, she asked her husband and her sister what happened to her baby. They explained to her that Nannie simply told them that the baby died, but they did notice that Nannie was holding a hat pin in her hand. When Malvina confronted the doctors, they could not give her a clear explanation as to what happened, as they too had no idea. All they could offer her were their condolences, leaving the young mother distraught and confused. I actually just recently learned what a hat pin was because I've never even heard of that before. I imagined it was one of those small little push pins that a seamstress would use for hanging fabric, and I was so wrong. It's this huge sharp needle that women would use to secure their hats on their hair, and it's like 6 to 12 inches, sometimes even longer, and it's a full sharp point to the end of it. I'll include images of a hat pin in the episode's Instagram post if nobody else also knows what it is, but it's like one of the scariest things to imagine getting pricked or stuck with, so I couldn't even imagine watching someone stick that into a newborn baby's head. It's crazy. So the death or suspected murder of their second child hit Malvina and her husband, Byron Higgins, very hard, and the two ultimately split, leading to Malvina beginning a new relationship with a soldier. Her mother did not approve of this relationship in the slightest, and it often led to fights between Nannie and Malvina, fights so bad that Malvina would flee the home and stay at her father's house for days on end. One of these fights ended like any other, after Malvina stormed out of her mother's home to go to her father's, but this time she left her son Robert Higgins in the house with her mother, and on July 7th of 1945, 2-year-old Robert was found dead under Nannie's care. That prior night, Nannie served little Robert a dessert that was purposely tainted with rat poison, causing his death. A formal autopsy was not conducted on the little boy's body, as his cause of death was simply ruled as asphyxia, but the manner as to how he was asphyxiated was unknown. This allowed Nannie to collect $500 from his life insurance policy that she took out on him just 2 months before his murder. $500 then was worth about $9,000 in today's economy, so it was a pretty hefty sum of money that Nannie was able to collect. Around the same time that Nannie collected her grandson's life insurance money, she collected another life as well. This time it was her husband, Frank Harrelson's. One day, Frank's friend returned home from his service in World War II, which prompted a group of his friends to go out for a night of drinking in the town. Unfortunately, later that night, Frank returned home to Nannie, and he forcibly raped her. The following day, she poured rat poison into his hidden moonshine stash, and later that evening, on September 15, 1945, he was found dead in his home, but without an autopsy or any suspicion of his wife. It was assumed that he died from food poisoning or another illness. Nannie Hazel carried on with her life as usual, despite the apparent loss of 2 people that were allegedly dearest to her. And as quickly as she got rid of her last husband, she was married yet again just before 1950, this time to a man named Arlie Lanning. The two met through a Lonely Hearts column in the local newspaper while Nannie was traveling through Lexington, North Carolina. The same type of section in the newspapers that she would skim and fantasize about when she was younger. This time, Nannie was able to turn her fantasies into a reality as she met Arlie and married him just 3 days later. However, history was going to repeat itself, as Arlie, like her second husband Robert, was a major alcoholic and womanizer. However, Nannie was the one who was often gone from the home, sometimes for weeks on end, because she traveled from North Carolina back to Alabama to take care of her younger sister, Dovey Hazel. Dovey suddenly became ill and bedridden and required frequent care, but just months after Nannie's arrival to her home, Dovey passed away in June of 1950 at the age of 41. The cause of her death was assumed to be that of her illness, as it was the obvious answer. However, it was later revealed that Dovey was poisoned by her older sister, causing her death. Nannie returned to North Carolina following her sister's death, where she continued to act as the perfect wife to Arlie. However, the death of her next victim soon came following her return to Lexington. Sarah Elizabeth Lanning, Arlie's mother, also lived with her son and his wife Nannie, but at 85 years old, on September 9, 1950, she was found dead in her sleep. It was obviously assumed that her age had just caught up to her and she peacefully passed in her sleep from natural causes. However, like many of Nannie's victims, Sarah Lanning was actually poisoned by her daughter-in-law, who would get away with her crimes yet again. Nannie, of course, stood by her husband's side and supported him through the loss of his mother. She remained kind, loving, and gracious towards Arlie throughout their relationship, That was until his mysterious death on February 16, 1952, at just 52 years old. Now, it was assumed that Arlie's death was attributed to heart failure due to his heavy drinking, as well as suspected complications from the flu virus that was rampant in the area at this time. However, unbeknownst to the community, Arlie's death was actually the direct result of poisoning, specifically rat poisoning, that Nannie planted in one of his meals, a pretty common practice of hers when she wanted to get rid of someone. Nevertheless, the townspeople of Lexington rallied together in support of Nannie and the tragic loss of her husband. Shortly after Arlie's death, the home he shared with his wife was meant to go to his sister if anything had ever happened to him. But as usual, disaster struck again, and the home mysteriously burned down. Arlie's sister was left with nothing, but Nannie was left with a large lump sum of insurance money, which she used to skip town, and she left the city of Lexington. Later that year, Nannie joined a dating service called the Diamond Circle Club, where she went on to meet Richard L. Morton of Jamestown, North Carolina. The two wed in 1952 in a little city called Emporia, Kansas, and Richard wasn't very different from Nannie's previous husbands. He wasn't a drunk like a couple of the previous men, but he was very unfaithful. For hours a day, Nannie found herself alone at home as her husband ventured into the town to meet and sleep with other women. However, she did have a brief distraction from this issue as her mother, Louisa Hazel, had recently moved into the couple's home following her husband James Hazel's passing in March of 1952. Within days of Louisa arriving at her daughter's home, she began to experience stomach pain and frequent spells of sickness. On January 3rd of 1953, Louisa Hazel passed away at the age of 74. Again, it was assumed that she simply fell ill due to her old age or some sort of sickness, but the truth was that she died at the hands of her own daughter from poisoning. And just 4 months later, on May 19th, 1953, Robert Morton also died in the home he shared with his wife and her mother. Nannie spiked his thermos of coffee with arsenic, and he fell ill and passed away almost immediately after. As you can assume, Nannie carried on with her life as if nothing ever happened. She boarded a bus to Tulsa, Oklahoma to meet her new love interest, Samuel Doss, and just a month later, in June of 1953, the two were now Mr. and Mrs. Doss. They began a life together, still residing in Oklahoma, and for the first time in her life, Nannie finally married a man who was not only faithful but also had no struggles with alcoholism or abuse. In fact, Samuel was actually a minister for the Church of Nazarene, who suffered his own great loss after his family died in a tornado disaster in Carroll County, Arkansas. But Nannie still found some fault in him as he constantly disapproved of her magazines and television shows that were not, in his opinion, quote, enlightening or educational. And he especially disapproved of her romance magazines. This was enough to make Nannie so upset that she left Samuel for a short period of time. That was until he put her name on his bank account, allowing her to take out 2 life insurance policies on her husband in which she was the sole beneficiary. It was only a few weeks after this when Nannie began reverting to her old self again, and she began trying to kill her new husband. Her first attempt at killing Samuel was with a prune cake dessert laced with arsenic. However, Samuel was admitted to the hospital where he spent a month recovering and eventually surviving the ordeal. Unfortunately, upon his return home, Nannie served him a cup of homemade coffee spiked with arsenic, and this unfortunately took his life on October 10, 1954. He was just 58 years old. Now, Samuel would end up being the final life Nannie would take, as there were far more suspicions surrounding his sickness and eventual death, suspicions that were mainly focused on Nannie. The physician who treated Samuel throughout his final days suspected that there was some sort of foul play, and he actually convinced Nannie to allow him to conduct an autopsy under the guise of wanting to, quote, save lives. He told Nannie that identifying what killed her husband could prevent another wife from losing hers. I'm unsure if Nannie thought maybe it was just time to give it up and dropped her unfortunate widow act, or maybe she truly believed that she's been getting away with all these things for this long, that she'll get away with this one too. But she agreed and allowed an autopsy to be conducted on her husband. Autopsy findings concluded that there was enough arsenic in Samuel Doss's body that it could kill a horse. And without any hesitation, the physician alerted police, who swiftly arrested and charged Nannie Doss with the murder of her husband. Her one and only request before her interrogation began was to be able to keep the latest romance magazine during her imprisonment, and in return she would admit to all the murders she carried out. This interrogation is where Nannie would go on to gain her monikers such as Giggling Granny, as she giggled and gleefully recounted her murders throughout the interrogation. Nannie confessed to killing all of her husbands. However, she stood firm on the idea that she never murdered her blood kin. However, this would go on to be proven untrue because police ordered for the exhumations of all of Nannie's confirmed and suspected victims, and they concluded that they all died from poisoning with either rat poisoning or arsenic. Eventually, Nannie confessed to all of her murders. 4 of her husbands, Frank Carlson in 1945, Arlie Lanning in 1952, Richard Morton in 1953, Samuel Doss in 1954, her sister, Dovey Hazel, in 1950, her grandson, Robert Higgins, in 1945, her mother-in-law, Sarah Lanning, in 1950, and finally, her own mother, Louisa Hazel, in 1953. Although Nannie committed her murders in the states such as North Carolina, Kansas, and Alabama, and even though they all charged her for the murders, it was the state of Oklahoma that ultimately charged and tried her for the first-degree murder of her husband, Samuel Doss, and the other states dropped their charges. She pled guilty to the charges on May 17, 1955, and was awaiting her sentencing. Her fate was either life imprisonment or death via the electric chair. If given death, Nannie would go on to be the first woman to ever be executed in the state of Oklahoma. 2 years went by, and after waiting in jail for her sentence, a judge declared her insane and spared her fate of the electric chair. Instead, she was sentenced to life in prison. Later, the judge would explain that he did not want to set the, quote, poor precedent of executing a woman, especially a woman with clear mental disabilities. Throughout her time in Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Nannie remained gleeful and often joked about her case, keeping up with her nickname, the quote, Giggling Granny, due to her oddly sunny disposition. In one interview from within her confinement, she joked about only being able to do one job while incarcerated, a job in the laundry department, because her other offers to work in the kitchen were consistently but politely declined for obvious reasons. But deep inside, she did begin to wish that she was instead put to death because, in her words, she would rather die than spend the rest of her life in prison walls. On June 2nd, 1965, it was the 10th anniversary of Nannie's incarceration when she died at 59 years old. Nannie ultimately passed away in the prison hospital due to complications from her battle with leukemia. She is buried at the Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma. And this has been the case of our Alabama serial killer, Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Granny. So we are now at the part of the episode where we give our police/detectives a rating as well as our judge and jury. So we will start with the police. I'm giving them a C- because, I understand that it was the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, but, this lady is running around, and maybe they don't have a very good record system back then. I don't know. Maybe they just wrote everything on a piece of paper and just kind of kept it going, but this lady lost everybody. And one thing about people, they talk. So if people in Idaho can hear about what somebody did in this isn't really a good analogy because I don't know the map that well, but I just feel like word of mouth is so strong, and that's kind of all they had. So honestly, it's not even like anybody could pick up the phone. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on the police because I don't know how they really could have kept track of how this lady was killing so many people. All these people are dying around her, and it was just oh, so unfortunate. And it was a time where probably everybody was just dying of random diseases because it was the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. But I don't know. I'm just I don't really think the police was really looking. But that probably was a really hard way to determine. I just feel like her first few murders in Alabama, they should have been yo, how? Especially in the hospital. She stuck a hat pin in a newborn baby's head, and everyone was just oh, we don't know how the baby died. Did the baby not have a gaping hole in its head? A newborn baby? I don't really know science. I'm going to change the police's rating. I think I'll give them a B. I'll give them a solid B because I don't think there's much they could have done, but I feel in my spirit that they could have done more. I don't know. Sorry, guys. For the judge/jury, in this case, just the judge, I'm giving him an A+ because I like the respect and the empathy, because it's really easy for somebody with that much power to be you know what? Kill that hoe. But he was no, she obviously has mental disabilities. And I feel at a time like that, nobody really acknowledged mental disabilities and wanted to really accept and believe that, yeah, they could really cause someone to do something really crazy all the time. So I really appreciate that he didn't want to set this precedent of just because she looks a little crazy and acts a little crazy doesn't mean she's not completely guilty. Like, let's just put her to death. Like, I think it takes a lot of level-headedness and empathy to be able to decide, you know, let's just let her spend the rest of her life in prison. And she was miserable anyway, so good job. I think it really does speak volumes to not wanting to put somebody with mental disabilities to death. And I'm definitely not one for anything like that. I feel like people with mental disabilities should definitely get all the grace in the world, because nobody really understands what they go through. Unless that is how your brain works, you will never understand. But I do just feel like, I don't know, I need to know how insane she really looked and came off, because I just feel like she was very intentional. Like, I understand that she had head trauma and she did act different, but I don't know. It seems like she was a little bit more sane than she probably put on. I don't know. But I do have a lot of respect for the judge, so I'm going to give him an A+, because at the end of the day, she still went. She was miserable in jail and she died. So it's all a happy ending on that front. My sources for this week's case have been encyclopediaofalabama.org, wikipedia.org, and wikitree.com. And that is a wrap for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to go ahead and support the show in any way you can. Please give me a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends and family about me. Post me on your stories. And yeah, write some good reviews. I'd really appreciate that. Go on the TikTok, go on the Instagram, follow the podcast. Don't forget to actually follow me. Make sure you get updates, because I do post every Wednesday. And thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for the support. And I love you all. Please take care of one another and be safe. I hope to see you all next week as we put the Mer in murder. Bye.